Worms are truly ancient lineages of animals, with evolutionary histories stretching back over hundreds of millions of years. Various worm groupings have been inhabiting our world since long before the time of dinosaurs, and the fact that they're still around today just shows how incredibly successful they've been. Now, as you'll know if you saw our What is a Worm video, the name worm isn't really a scientific title that denotes a specific grouping of organisms that all share a common ancestor. Instead, it refers to a type of body plan, essentially anything that looks, well, wormy. As such, when talking about the origin of worms, we could be alluding to any number of different groups of animals that are vaguely worm-like. In fact, you could probably count some of the members of the Ediacaran fauna as worms, such as the basal animal Dickinsonia, which sort of looks like a polychaete, the recently named Icaria, or bizarre denizens of the Burgess Shale such as Hallucigenia, which is actually related to the velvet worms. But to avoid this video going on forever and all kinds of evolutionary confusion, we're going to stick to the origins of the three what could be considered main groupings of organisms we call worms today. The Annelids, which includes earthworms, bristleworms, leeches and others, the Nematodes, also called roundworms, and the Platyhelminthes, or flatworms. Plus, we'll take a quick look at the end at a few other worm groupings that have a particularly interesting fossil record. First though, the Annelids. The evolutionary history of this group of worms can be traced back over 500 million years ago, with ancient relatives being represented by fossils present in the famous Middle Cambrian Burgess Shale of Canada, about 508 million years old. These include the species Canadia spinosa and Burgessochaeta setigera, both of which are fairly confidently agreed to be prehistoric members of the grouping Polychaeta within Annelids. Though the actual classification of polychaetes is a bit of a nightmare, and it's likely that they're paraphyletic, or an unnatural evolutionary grouping. But anyway, there was also some debate amongst paleontologists as to whether the strange little Wiwaxia from the Burgess Shale and other locations was an annelid too, though more evidence seems to be mounting which suggests it's probably a mollusk. A very interesting insight into annelid origins was published in 2018, when another worm from the Burgess Shale was named and described, Scolex, which was so exceptionally preserved that it even retained potential neural and vascular tissues, the first time this had happened in a fossil annelid. Even more significantly though, it enabled paleontologists to work out how the annelid head evolved. The bristles running down the sides of the animal, called chaetae, continue onto the head segment, suggesting that the head of annelids actually formed from posterior, more general segments of the body that over time specialized into this structure. An interesting perspective into the developmental biology of annelid worms. For a while, before the discovery of Scolex, it was thought that Canadia and Burgessochaeta were the oldest annelid worms known to science. However, even older annelids were discovered during the intervening years. One probable annelid that pushed back the history of this group further was Phragmochaeta, named in 2008 and based on fossils from Lower Cambrian rocks in Greenland, about 518 million years old. The paleontologists describing it placed it as a polychaete and noted that it had around 20 segments, a straight gut, bristle structures they seemingly used to propel themselves along the seafloor, and no jaws. Possibly the oldest annelid currently known to science though is Yellingia, a recently described ancient bilaterian animal that dates to between 551 and 539 million years ago, during the Ediacaran. Fossils of this species come from South China, and traces of the trackways have also been discovered, showing that this was one of the earliest animals that was capable of moving by itself and also exhibiting decision making. Researchers can't be sure that this was definitely an annelid however, suggesting that it's either related to the annelids or panarthropods. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that if Yellingia were alive today, we'd call it a worm, and it's amazing that this organism has had such significant implications for how we think about the history of life itself, as it hints that complex animals were around in the Ediacaran, and therefore the famous Cambrian explosion that occurred later may have been a less dramatic explosion of life than we thought. Anyway, according to a 2007 study, it wasn't until the Ordovician, about 480 million years ago, that the polychaete annelids started to properly diversify. It's during the early Ordovician that fossil annelid jaws start to appear in the record, and so it's probably around then that the annelid crown group originated. Oligochaetes, the group including terrestrial earthworms, then possibly originated sometime during the Mesozoic, though there is some evidence suggesting an earlier beginning, but this has been disputed. So there's actually a pretty fascinating history to these worms' early evolution. But as with most things in paleontology, many more fossils and studies will be needed before we can be more confident about how the annelids arose, and it's still an ongoing area of research. Right then, next we'll look at the nematodes. This worm lineage is another absolutely ancient group of organisms and a truly fascinating phylum of animals. I could make an entire video on nematodes themselves. They're literally found everywhere, in pretty much every environment on Earth, including inside humans. It's been estimated that there are probably around 40,000 different species of nematodes, and they're actually one of the most numerically abundant type of animal on the planet. So prevalent that a 2019 study calculated there to be around 4.4 times 10 to the 20 nematodes in total across all topsoils on Earth. That's a lot of worms. So nematodes are clearly an important and ridiculously successful lineage of animals. But when did they originate? Well, since the majority of these worms are tiny, microscopic and soft-bodied creatures, though there are exceptions, such as the 13-meter-long species that parasitizes the sperm whale, it makes finding fossils of them very difficult. However, there are some indications of their presence in deep time. Amazing fossils of nematodes have been found preserved in amber from the Cenozoic, but it's the more ancient fossils that provide better hints towards the group's initial evolution. Currently, the oldest known nematode body fossils are specimens from Scotland that date to the early Devonian, about 396 million years ago. They were found associated with a prehistoric land plant, with clusters of eggs, juveniles and adults all inhabiting the tissues of the plant, indicating a very old parasitic relationship between nematodes and plants that still occurs today. But this isn't the oldest evidence of nematodes in the fossil record, since in early Ordovician rocks from China that date to about 470 million years ago, there are tiny cylindrical burrows in prehistoric marine sediments that were most likely formed by these worms, increasing the oldest known age of nematodes by over 70 million years. And there's more. Fossils have been found in the remarkable Chengjiang biota, dating to the early Cambrian around 518 million years ago, that represent members of the related Nematomorpha phylum, indicating that since these relatives have been around since the Cambrian, it's likely that nematodes themselves existed then too, and possibly lived even longer ago in the Precambrian as well. Indeed, George Poinar, an expert on nematodes, suspects that these animals potentially date back to as early as 1 billion years ago, and we just haven't found the fossils of them yet. So the nematodes also have a fascinating early evolutionary history represented by some pretty amazing fossils. Next, where did the platyhelminthes, the tapeworms and flatworms, come from? One of the oldest records of these worms in the fossil record is found in a shark coprolite, fossilized feces, from the Permian. The specimen contains a total of 93 small, smooth structures that are interpreted by the paleontologists as being the eggs of a tapeworm. Remarkably, one of the eggs is even thought to preserve a developing larva inside it, and the morphology and pattern in which the eggs are deposited strongly indicates that they were laid by an ancient member of Cestoda, the grouping that includes modern tapeworms. So this discovery gives us some perspective as to the timeline of platyhelminth evolution. They seem to have been around at least 270 million years ago in the Permian. However, there is some more potential evidence for their existence before this time. Fossil hook structures found in much older Devonian rocks from Latvia might have originated from flatworms too. These fossils are mostly associated with or actually attached to prehistoric placoderm and acanthodian fishes, indicating a parasitic lifestyle. But the exact classification of what kind of parasitic organism can't be said for certain. The hooks do look like those found in cestodes, however it's also possible that they came from a different phyla of parasitic worm, Acanthocephala. Like the nematodes, there are also some amazing fossil platyhelminthes that have been found preserved in Cenozoic amber, such as a 40 million year old specimen in the order Rhabdocela that retains developing eggs inside the body cavity. The platyhelminthes are therefore another pretty ancient and fascinating lineage of worms, and I'm sure that future, probably even older examples of these flatworms will eventually be discovered that continue to elucidate the origin of these organisms. As we've already established, a lot of different animal groups are called worms, and these other lineages do sometimes have some interesting representatives in the fossil record. One of these is the phylum Priapolida, marine animals often referred to as penis worms. I'll leave it to you to decide why they got that name. There's a well-known extinct genus from the Cambrian, best represented in the Burgess Shale of Canada, called Otoya that is potentially a member of the stem group Priapolida, though the exact relationships of this genus as well as many other of its relatives is a truly complicated mess. The The phylum Onychophora, the velvet worms, also has some interesting extinct members, with the stem group potentially containing such creatures as Hallucigenia from the Burgess Shale, as well as other equally weird animals, including possibly Microdictyon and Paucipodia from China, though again the classification of these worms is still not entirely clear. So there we have it, the origins of some worms at least. Researching for this video has honestly been a wonderful experience. The ancient evolution of worms is something I'd just never really given any thought to before, but after having read about it I now see that it's an absolutely fascinating topic. I hope I've been able to pass on some of this fascination with prehistoric worms to you, and I think it perfectly demonstrates how even the seemingly most humble of organisms can have a rich and extensive evolutionary history that's very much worth investigating and learning about, and in some cases has profound implications for how we think about the very history of life on this planet. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying Worm Week so far. We've still got a lot more great worm videos coming, so be sure to subscribe and spread the word. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters, especially our Dinosaur tier supporters Corey Peterson, George Vojtek, Mayer's World, Nicole Bueno, Pasta, Mark Fawn, Dominic Bathy and Alex Hawke. If you would like to find out more about worms, their history, and the wonderful worms that surround us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.